Directors wield a huge amount of power, but it's only usually at AGMs that they are in the spotlight. But in the wake of the latest round of corporate scandals...
You've had Bellamy's, you've had obviously Slater and Gordon losing over $1 billion, whistleblower issues at Origin, the China issue with Crown. So it's been a very busy time for corporate scandals and then the whole question of director accountability that should flow from that.
The Australian Shareholders Association wants to shine a light.
Shareholders tend to focus on the CEO, and the media does the same thing and the analysts do the same thing. So there probably arguably isn't enough focus on the real power that lies on the board. We need directors to come out from the shadows and be more accountable for their decision making.
Directors are the power behind the throne. They set the strategy and direction of a company.
When something goes wrong, I think most people have an understanding of the liability and responsibility of directors in a particular case. But I think if you asked the average shareholder or the average person, what do directors do, I think you'd get a vast variety of answers to that.
I think the CEO is ultimately responsible for the oversight of the implementation of the strategy. There's been a change whereby the board's role is moving towards growth, change and risk. So the board has an obligation to oversee the implementation of strategy. It has an obligation to oversee the management of identified risks. And critically, it has an obligation to look towards emerging governance items. So I think the board has to take a greater responsibility for setting the strategy and overseeing it and allowing the management to operate. So I think, yes, I think it's a bit unfair that sometimes we look towards the CEO and not put enough pressure on the expectations of the board.
The AICD runs a training program for current and wannabe directors, using case studies of former scandals to ward against new ones. Trevor Matthews has been a director for over 20 years, but only recently did the course and was concerned by some of what he heard.
We were asked as a group of people to come up and mark on the board, based on our experience of the boards we'd served on or were serving on, how effective we thought the boards were. And we had a spectrum from 0 to 100. And I put some crosses up here towards the top end because I'm lucky enough to be on some very good boards at the moment. But I was amazed how many crosses there were down the other end.
Judging an individual director is very hard.
One of the problems is that you don't have visibility inside the boardroom. So for collective decisions, it's hard to blame individual directors and hold them to account. So shareholders tend not to vote against any of the directors because they don't know which one was most to blame. So there is an argument that directors should be more visible, they should be more available to shareholders, and they should be more accountable when there are major mistakes that happen at a company.
I think that is a flawed understanding of the role that the board as a collective plays, that once a board made up of individuals makes a decision, then that is the board decision, and that is what the decision that's communicated in the case of the ASX company to the exchange and more broadly. And I think that anybody trying to get at what individuals contributed to that is unhelpful.
And that role is changing.
I think what we've seen in the last 20 years is a great evolution from boards who took a much more master-servant relationship, master-servant mindset, through to one of engagement. The expectation is that boards, I think, directed in the latter part of last century, and now there's a much greater need for them to provide genuine oversight to protect the assets of the organisation.
Cabinet solidarity stops directors speaking out. And if a director no longer believes their views are in line with the board's, they can leave. But no explanation is required.
The ASA board next week is most likely to change our policies, and this is the recommendation, requiring that a company must give a full explanation when a director resigns, so we don't get a repeat of the situation with Sheila McGregor at 7 West Media.
The former director resigned in February as scandal engulfed the company.
What the ASA is proposing is that it's no longer acceptable to say nothing. If a director resigns on a matter of principle, then the company should inform the stock exchange as to why that director has resigned.
The chairman has stood by his embattled CEO, raising questions about whether they are too close.
What I say is that the chair-CEO relationship should be one of respect, not friendship. It's for the chair to give the message of performance or concern to the CEO. So if I'm on a board as a non-executive director and I have any issues with my CEO, I put all my pressure on the chair. and the chair needs to manage that expectation. There's no point in me putting pressure on the CEO.
Members of boards are trying to get organisations into a good place. I think when things go wrong, it depends on the circumstances. The world, no doubt, has changed. The important role of the chairman, of course, and the board is to hire and fire the CEO. That's a really important decision, and I think most good boards spend a lot of time on that issue in the succession planning process, in the selection process, in the evaluation process.
Boards generally stick to the shadows, but there have been some notable exceptions.
You have seen some directors get onto Twitter. So, Jeff Kennett at 7 West and the former Transfield Services chair, Diane Gander-Smith, she's on Twitter, and there's a range of others. And that's probably a healthy thing.
Which raises the question whether more directors should speak out.
Well, I think that it's primarily the CEO's responsibility to do that. I think there's room for the chairman to be there, supportive as well. But I really don't think the other NEDs should get involved in the public debate. I think their job is behind the scenes, with their heads down, really trying to help the organisation make decisions, implement strategy well, and that sort of thing. I think it can get a bit messy if directors, non-executive directors, decide to speak out or are invited to speak out on all sorts of different things. It's very important for a company to have a clear level of understanding and a clear, strong agreement between management and the chairman and the board, and it's up to, I think, the CEO mainly, and perhaps some support from the chairman to tell the story.
Diversity at the top remains a huge issue for boards. 75% of directors of top 200 companies are men, despite a near decade-long push to redress the gender imbalance.
25% after making a big effort for quite a number of years, and Women on Boards has collected data since 2010, isn't particularly startling progress, but it is progress.
I think it's a massive issue. Again, I think we've made a fair bit of progress in this country compared to some of the other countries. There's no doubt that having a diverse group of people leads to better quality decisions. It's quite an interesting transition for boards to go through as they become more diverse, but once they get over that initial hurdle, they can really perform a lot better. And I've seen that firsthand in a number of different situations. So yeah, I think it's something we've got to keep the pressure on in the Australian community.
14 ASX 200 companies have no women on their boards, including high-profile names like Flight Centre and internet provider TPG. Women on Boards, Ruth Med, says that's an outrage, adding that in Flight Centre's case, it's a contradiction of the public image the company tries to present.
What do their staff look like? And the fact that they have a board of all male isn't really giving much of a message to the people who work long and hard for that company.
I think the change I've noticed is that maybe 20 years ago, board members were sought out because of their technical skill. If you think about a board as a team, the work that I do is to try and get the most out of the team. And so in any team composition, you need both technical experts and behavioural experts. So I am seeing that people, the needs of board members is broadened from technical to behavioural, and therefore those skills can be acquired at an earlier stage.
In the 21st century, perhaps we need experience of people with IT skills, cybersecurity skills, understanding the global environment. Secondly, we probably need people with experience in what's affectionately called digital media. Those sorts of people won't have the length of experience that the people who say we can't find women with enough experience are ever likely to have.
By experience, boards generally mean they want a former chief executive.
I think we are seeing impact. One of the things that I always say is that the board should be representative of the environment in which it operates. So on one board that I was on in disability care in hearing, it was important that we understood we had different perspectives. On school boards, for example, there's a lot more people who are bringing an independent perspective as well as the parents. So I think if the organisation is a particular area, the board representation needs to be representative of that environment.
On the broader issue of how boards are performing, there's a general glass half full perspective.
I think the expectations on people are higher, and therefore people are being held more to account, whether there's actually a greater number or whether the expectations of directors is changing. So perhaps more are coming to light as we move through this evolution into modern governance.
Is it fair to say we only really know if a board's good if something goes wrong?
It's a good question. I think the board's role is to leave the organisation in a better shape than when they took on the role. And often society only looks towards the negative and the growth, and then in the listed space, we're still in an evolution whereby we're awarding longer term asset value.
I think we're in pretty good shape here in Australia. I really do, in spite of some of the criticism that you see. I know that my fellow directors, in all the ones I'm involved with, take it really seriously. They're very conscientious, they're very conscious of the obligations, the responsibilities, the big weight, if it's a shareholder-owned organisation, that you've got on your shoulders. I think we're in quite good shape. My most recent experience was in the UK, which again has gone through a lot of change in terms of...
That may be the case for many boards, but as recent scandals prove, there's still a lot of dodgy behaviour occurring in the shadows.